Thank you, Gretchen Morgenson, for joining. For those of you who don't know, Gretchen Morgenson is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist in the area of Wall Street reporting, NBC News reporter, and has done an awful lot of work on this in the past year, and has just published her new book, These Are the Plunderers, How Private Equity Runs and Wrecks America. And welcome, Gretchen.
Thank you, Mitch. I'm delighted to be here. And boy, there are a lot of heroes in this room, I know. So happy to be here. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, I'm just muting someone in the background there. So thanks for joining us very much. We are going to be discussing essentially the pathophysiology of private equity. And this is a nice crossover between the worlds of medicine and the worlds of economics and finance, because I think private equity is such a poorly named term, probably by design, that when we talk about it within medicine, I think an awful lot of times physicians either have no idea what I'm saying or think of it as private ownership. And so the opposite of private ownership must be communism, and then the conversation just kind of degrades from there. The other thing that physicians hear is simply the pitch from the private equity firms if they have a practice to sell. So I wanted to name this the pathophysiology because we're really talking about mechanisms. And there has been a discussion, you'll hear it later if you stick around for the talk with the American Medical Association and with our specialty societies and groups that lead medicine, that we don't really know if private equity is bad for healthcare. We don't know if it's bad for medicine. We need more data. And certainly in the history of medicine, data and studies are important to figure out an outcome. But there's also that study in the British Medical Journal about whether or not a parachute is needed to jump out of an airplane. So maybe we should randomize a parachute versus a non-parachute and have people jump out in an airplane and see if we need the data. And to me, and I think with your book, the mechanism is obvious that it's completely incompatible with the healthcare system, but also the economy in general. So could you help break us down what is the private equity playbook or the pathophysiology?
Okay, well, yeah, you're right, Mitch, in saying that private equity is a name that doesn't really convey what is going on in these transactions. What I like to say is that these are really the leveraged buyouts from the 1980s that really took the kind of country by storm with RJR Nabisco. That was the first really big deal. So what these companies do is they buy other companies. They use a tremendous amount of debt to take over those companies. That's where the leverage comes in to the term leveraged buyout. They then hope to streamline or make more efficient the operations of the company and hope to sell it in about 5 to 7 years. So basically, what you have is, as one nursing home advocate described to me, it's capitalism on steroids. And so you have a tremendous short-term interest in maximizing profits, which of course I think is directly imperils the potential for patient care. So in healthcare, you have private equity really at odds with the whole concept of putting patient care ahead of profits, because these companies are searching for a profit within 5 to 7 years, and that is what they're all about. And so that takes precedence. And that is why it feels to me like it's incompatible with healthcare. Now, you mentioned earlier that, we need more academic studies. Well, we have had 30 to 40 years of experience with leveraged buyouts. And we have seen academic studies that show that companies that are subject to these buyouts go bankrupt far more often than companies that don't. It's absolutely understandable because of the nature of the heavy debt that's involved. That increases the costs associated with operating the company. So you have a lot of academic work and unbiased academic work, I want to make clear, because there is a lot of academic work that is bought and paid for by the private equity world. So unbiased academic research is beginning to show the damage that's done. Of course, we had the tremendous nursing home study, which showed that private equity owned nursing homes had greater mortality rates than even nursing homes owned by other for-profit entities. Now, that was a particularly powerful study because it was longitudinal, and the academics concluded that 20,000 lives had been lost, largely because of the, quote, efficiency mechanisms that the private equity firms are so typically doing. For instance, reducing staff, cutting back on services. So I think that we have the academic studies and we have the 30 years of experience to show that this kind of a transaction doesn't always help, but it certainly is completely at odds with delivering high quality patient care.
Thanks. So can we break down a little bit of where the money flows in a private equity firm? And there's a couple terminology, a few terms there, like general partner, limited partner, and then there's these creditors, and then there's the company that's purchased, and they're not the private equity firm, but they're owned by them. Can you help us break that down a little bit?
Sure. So a private equity firm raises money to go out and buy a company. They then put that debt on the company itself. So the private equity firm is not taking on the debt. So if the company goes down, as Envision recently filed for bankruptcy, then it's the company that's in bankruptcy. It is certainly not affecting the private equity firm that owns the company. So you have right there, you have an interesting sort of separation and almost a protection for the firm itself. The firm is not impacted by a bankruptcy. The firm is not impacted by, for instance, if there is a Medicare fraud case. The firm that owns the company that is accused of Medicare fraud or that settles with the Justice Department, that's the company that pays for it. And so the private equity firm itself is kind of protected in that way and in the corporate structure. Now, the private equity firm they are a general partner and they have limited partners. They put up a small percentage of their own money, and then they go out to pension funds, to institutions, to endowments, and they raise money from them. These are investors who are trying to make a return for their pensioners, for their endowments, for college educations. And these are their limited partners. They're just investors on the scene in the private equity fund. And so they put up the lion's share of the money for a takeover. So that's how that works.
And I think actually Eileen Applebaum had noted it's something like 2 cents on the dollar is what the general partners put up as far as capital goes.
It's a very small percentage. So again, if the investment fails, it really is the limited partners, the pensions, the endowments, the institutional investors. It's really their problem if there is a bankruptcy or a failure.
And I think that's one of these keys, is that we're seeing this, like, it's risk shifting. So there's a concentration of financial of wealth. And what I understand is not very transparent fees to the pension plans, which it kind of hits workers twice. We're talking about people who are working, who maybe their conditions are getting worse because of cuts with private equity. And then if they're fortunate enough to have a pension, the burden of a failure falls on them. Is that?
Absolutely. I mean, the pension funds, CalPERS, CalSTRS, all of these massive pools of capital that aim to make a more prosperous retirement for their beneficiaries. These are the people, these are the entities that provide the oxygen for private equity. Private equity would be nowhere without these investors. And so it is a complete paradox that the very funds, the pensions, who have as their beneficiaries workers in many cases, invest in a type of transaction that harms workers because they're more likely to be fired in a private equity takeover as part of the efficiency that's created. It's just a complete paradox to me. So the pension funds are a huge part of the puzzle here. And now the question has become even more sort of unsettling, because the returns of private equity had traditionally been pretty good, better than the S&P 500. They had been, they were creating alpha, is the terminology on Wall Street. They were creating outsized gains for these pension funds. Now that is no longer happening. Now you can get the same returns, academic studies show, in an S&P 500 fund that is fully transparent, where you know where everything stands at the end of the business trading day, and there are virtually no fees, maybe 0.6% or 0.6%. So it's really become a driving question. Why are these pensions continuing to facilitate transactions that are very damaging?
I think it was John Bogle who said, with investing, you get what you don't pay for. And sort of the opposite of what we normally see. And to me, it feels like the pension funds are almost being, and the workers are being duped into digging their own grave. That's how I viewed it. But let me move it forward and ask the devil's advocate question, like, why might these be useful? And it varies by industry, because I know there's this idea of efficiencies and we're going to run things better and all that. In medicine, at least in emergency medicine, theoretically, part of the issue is that the insurance companies are really big, and we needed something else to fight them. There's a little feedback, something else on there, but does that any of that play out? What in theory could the private equity firm add to? Well,
again, it's, you have to differentiate between the kinds of firms that really do provide equity, who invest in the entity, invest in the practice, invest in the company, that don't pile the debt on. It really is a difference between what the capital structure is. And if you are a big major private equity firm like Apollo, Blackstone, Carlyle, you're involved in these kinds of leveraged, very heavily leveraged buyouts. If you have a private equity firm that actually makes an equity involved, has an equity interest in the company they're buying, where they actually have skin in the game of significance, where they're actually going to be hurt if something goes wrong, that's a different story, Mitch. That's a different story. So you have to look at the incentives, and you have to say, okay, I want to align with an entity that is going to have if you're in the healthcare industry, if it's going to have the interests of the patient at heart. Or if you're going to be in the restaurant industry, it's going to have the interest of the patrons of the restaurants at heart. So instead of just focus on profit, you want to have an entity beside you who is going to have the same interests you do in serving your customer, whoever that person is. And so when you see some of these takeovers of, say, dermatology practices, you start to see the private equity push for seeing more patients, not allowing a doctor to spend the time with a patient that they would, producing more tests, costly tests. So you just start to see these incentives that are accrue to a major, big, heavily indebted private equity firm takeover. And that would be different from one in which someone had an equity stake and wanted the same sort of longer term outcome that an owner would.
You make a good point there about equity and just finances being needed. In emergency medicine, Dr. McNamara had pointed out, we're not buying a hospital, we're not buying CT scanners, we're not employing the nurses. we don't need that much equity except really to float a salary for a couple of months. So there's not that much financial capital that's actually needed to run an emergency group. And I see that that's not the case in every single field of medicine. Sometimes the physicians do own that. And so I take your point that equity might be needed. That could be even a private loan, fixed interest loan, which is probably the simplest way that could go. But now we have private equity with this leverage buyout angle. And I wonder if the private equity guys say why that would be better for emergency medicine groups or something, or is there any basis that they could even stand on?
Well, I think that it is not a surprise, Mitch, that the surprise billing came out of a major private equity firm, that the problem of having out of network bills come to someone who went to the emergency department at one of the most vulnerable times of their life. They're ill, they're desperate, they need care immediately. That it is not a surprise that you would have that kind of business model create this kind of an end run around, the usual sort of, if the hospital's in network, they're going to, have a bill that they would recognize and be able to pay. So I just think that these firms are so determined to generate an enormous profit in as quickly a period as they can, that it creates these incentives for bad behavior. And when you're talking about life and death, and when you're talking about hospitals and you're talking about physician practices, that is a genuine problem. It is maybe not so big a problem if you're talking about Dunkin' Donuts, which is private equity owned. Okay, if I don't like their coffee and their donut, I can go next door to somebody else. But when you're talking about healthcare, an emergency department in a hospital that I, need to go to, that's closest to me, that's just such a different story.
Yeah, and this is really good transition actually to our next talk. But you make a point that I think economists would call it an inelastic market. If you're dying of a heart attack, you're going to pay whatever it is. And so once the hospitals and these groups have both the fact that you can't predict it, you can't shop around to the next donut shop while you're having a heart attack. It's an extra level of unethical, I think. And I'll just point out one other thing. There's one book review that was critical of your book, and even that at the same time said, well, okay, yeah, we should probably regulate healthcare because that's where we cross the line,
By the way, the person who wrote that review is a big private equity guy, and he did not disclose it initially to the entity that published his review. So, but we made them change that. Look, I am not their friend. I get that, but it is really an issue for healthcare. It's an issue for education. It's an issue for industries that really that are a social good, that are part of the social fabric. And that really is where I think we need to focus.